In one of my favourite survivor memoirs, Susanna Kaysen wrote that suicide is more complicated than wanting to die. It's about wanting to exile a part or parts of yourself. The parts of yourself that hold terrifying sensory fragments from the past and are stuck, unable to metabolize the fear, despair, and rage they bear. The parts of you that carry shame. The parts of you exhausted from years of carrying that shame in tense muscle and locked jaw. The parts of you convinced that no one is ever coming to the rescue to help you hold space for your pain and let you know you're okay. My name is Scarlett, and I'm a 27-year-old dissociative survivor of complex trauma, coming to you from unceded Darug land. This year I celebrated 4 years without a suicide attempt, and this 10-year personal best could not have been possible without the relationships that have supported me to embrace these young, traumatized, shame-ridden parts of myself. Parts I tried for decades to exile to unconsciousness with starvation, self-harm, or suicide. We all have different parts of ourselves, but complex trauma meant that mine never had the opportunity to integrate, fragmenting my consciousness and memory so a part of me could carry on with daily life and coexist with my abusers. This sophisticated defense mechanism is known as structural dissociation. Living with a dissociative disorder is like trying to drive a bus with 30 different passengers all trying to be backseat drivers, all insisting the bus should go in different directions. Some breathe down your neck, berating you for every navigational decision. Some are small children and sob in the corner with their backs to the others, forcing you to take your eyes from the road. Some try to smash the windows of the bus in a bid to escape it entirely, and occasionally, some hijack the bus and push you out of the driver's seat. Many survivors like me are left feeling confused and alone. The fact is, dissociative disorders and complex trauma more generally are largely overlooked in mainstream Australian mental health and social services. When even the professionals and the experts don't understand what's going on, how can we even begin to make sense of ourselves? How can we feel anything but shame when saddled with explanations for our distress that locate the problem within us rather than around us, in experiences of abuse, neglect, violence, and intergenerational oppression? This shame and blame is a huge problem, and it shouldn't be, because the reality is we are far from alone. 1 in 4 Australian adults live with a legacy of complex trauma, and recent Australian research found that dissociative disorders are nearly as common as depression. So what possibilities for healing exist for dissociative survivors? The key is that complex trauma is relational and is healed in relationship. Attuned relationships, whether with friends and fellow survivors or with therapeutic professionals, allow me to greet all parts of myself gently and with curiosity so that I can find out what their needs are and learn to soothe them. It is through attuned relationships that I've been able to experiment with new ways of relating to myself and my bus passengers as the safe, reliable person I needed when I was growing up with abuse and neglect. Recovery is not a destination to return to after going mad. In my case, where abuse and violence began in infancy, there is no meaningful destination to return to. For me, recovery and healing are about learning to return to my body after having to vacate it for years to survive. Recovery is about learning to be soothed by others, so I don't have to try and exile the parts of me in need of soothing, so they don't need to intrude upon me so dramatically and destructively. Of course, there is a basic level of safety and stability that is required before this phase of healing is possible. Complex trauma set me up for decades of re-traumatization, in the justice, psychiatric, child protection, public housing, and welfare systems. It wasn't until I finally received the disability pension after 2 years of applying, till I finally received victims' compensation nearly 6 years after my rape, till I finally made it to the top of a list for public outpatient support after my 7th suicide attempt and 18th involuntary hospitalisation, that I finally had some reprieve from crisis mode. And this is where I want to be careful when I talk about recovery and healing. It's easy to inspire you with a then and now comparison. Back then, I flunked out of uni twice. I was in and out of the emergency department every month. Despair and loneliness were my constant companions. Now I'm on the Dean's list for academic excellence. I'm healthier than I've ever been, and despair and loneliness are infrequent visitors and taste more like tenderness than terror. It is both true that I have worked very hard to make these things happen, to secure financial and housing stability and access to therapy, and it is true that whiteness and social capital have given me a decent head start on some survivors. If we're not careful, recovery narratives risk elevating good survivors who appear to work hard to heal above bad survivors who appear to be stuck in a rut for decades, facing ongoing victimization. These narratives erase the power asymmetries among survivors that expand or limit their access to healing tools. We tend to think of recovery as the individual pursuit of linear progress, but my story, like so many others, illustrates that individualism is a myth. It takes a village to parent a child, and it can take a village to reparent a survivor of complex trauma. The complex trauma I've experienced since childhood has defined my life. To insist otherwise would be to deny the gravity of what I've been through. It does nothing to facilitate healing and insults other survivors. Only by recognizing and learning about the way trauma has shaped my nervous system, my sense of self, and my patterns of relating to others, have I been able to begin to rewire my brain and reparent myself. Everyone's nervous system, sense of self, and patterns of relating are shaped by their childhoods and their relationships, but we only hear about it when it goes wrong. And even then, not enough people are making this connection. I cannot overstate the value that learning about complex trauma has had for me as a survivor. Where the dominant story of mental suffering shames and pathologizes, the story of complex trauma highlights how my emotional distress and altered states are not about what is wrong with me, but about what has happened to me and the very sophisticated ways that my body and mind have learned to adapt and survive. But it is not simply a matter of self-compassion for survivors, although the stories we tell have an enormous impact on survivors' sense of shame. It is a matter of telling stories that cultivate better institutional, cultural, and legislative responses to complex trauma. I believe healing is possible for everyone, but only if people have the opportunity to heal, only with safety from violence, affordable access to long-term trauma-informed therapy, and freedom from the kind of violence, the kind of slow violence enacted by bureaucracies that are designed to help people, but which often do the opposite. To secure these basic things for people, it matters what stories we tell. It matters when a young woman is told her personality is disordered, and not told that betrayal and violation in her early life explain her suffering. It matters when a man is shamed for drug addiction, and not told that far from being a character flaw, it makes perfect sense that he would want to exile to unconsciousness certain memories and feelings given the sexual abuse he grew up with. It feels important for me to share that not all of my bus passengers are happy that I'm here today. do not appreciate being visible because visibility has been dangerous for us. It's a constant struggle for me to hold their fears alongside that which I know to be true. That seeing, being seen, and being held in mind by another person and learning to become comfortable with that kind of intimacy is the ultimate antidote to shame. For me, nothing has done more to dispel the shame at the core of trauma than the company and friendship of other people coming to terms with their pain and being supported to heal. I've been very fortunate to meet some of my closest friends through art therapy, through complex trauma psychoeducation groups, through peer support for suicide attempt survivors, through yoga. My therapists over the years have provided the safe container that I need to sit with the paradox of longing to be seen while desperately fearing being visible to another. This is why it matters what stories we tell, why it matters how we talk about people who suffer chronic homelessness or self-harm or eating disorders, because it takes a whole of society approach to set up opportunities for safety and healing. Relationship is where we find the possibility of healing.